Hey, it's Professor Gould. In this section, we're going to talk about molecular bonds, which is when we put two or more atoms together. We make something called a molecule. These are, we make molecular bonds by either giving electrons from one atom to another or by sharing electrons, or in some cases, just because electrons are attracted to each other. We'll come back to that. That'll make sense. And then when we make a molecule, we have a special way of writing it where we use the chemical symbols, so H and O, hydrogen and oxygen, and then the subscript tells us how many of each of those we have. If we have one, we don't put a subscript. So H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, and of course that's the molecule that makes water. So molecules are formed by creating what we call chemical bonds between atoms. These are, again, either because the atoms gave away or took an electron, shared their electrons, or because there's attraction between the electrons. But the bonds always have to do with those little tiny electrons spinning around in a cloud around the nucleus. Now, all atoms are most stable when their outer shell of electrons is either completely empty or completely full. And for everything except electron, that means that the shell inside is going to be completely full. Anyway, for hydrogen and helium, remember those are the top two on our periodic table. They only have a max of 2 electrons. So a hydrogen atom, it has 1 electron, 1 proton, 1 neutron. If we either give it 1 extra electron or get rid of this electron, then the hydrogen is stable. As long as it has this electron, it's trying to either get another electron or give up an electron. It's trying to react with something else and form a chemical bond. A chemical reaction is just the creation or breaking of chemical bonds. Everything else is going to have 8 max electrons in their outer shell. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell, so it wants to add 4. And because of that, carbon can bond to up to 4 things at once. This does make carbon a little bit of a slut. Don't slut shame carbon, it's just the way it was made. Now, when 2 atoms share their electrons, we call that a covalent bond. These are called the valence electrons, the ones in the outer shell. So covalent means they are cooperating to share those valence electrons. Each of the atoms in the bond gets to pretend that it has both of the electrons. So the hydrogen here has 2 electrons. The carbon also gets both of these electrons. So by sharing, they each act like they both have the electrons and they both fill their outer shells. So each of these hydrogens has 2 electrons and the carbon now has 8 electrons. Notice this didn't change the number of protons. Carbon still has 4 protons in its nucleus. Okay, this only affects the number of electrons in the outer shell. So this is carbon making 4 covalent bonds with hydrogen molecules. So we write CH4, and this is methane. This is natural gas. Now, when we draw molecules, we can give them their name using the symbols. We can give them a chemical name, such as methane or formaldehyde, which is this one, Ch2-2. Or we can draw the atoms and their bonds. So we can draw all of the electrons where each of them is here. We can draw lines showing those pairs of electrons. We can draw it to show the space that those electrons are filling, or we can draw it like a ball and stick. All of these things mean the same thing. Okay, so you'll see molecules written or shown in any of these configurations. They all mean the same thing. Okay, either a line means 2 electrons, 2 lines together is a double bond, meaning they share 4 electrons. Now, atoms don't always share electrons. Remember, they might give 1 or take 1. So here we have sodium, Na for sodium. The symbol comes from the Greek word natron, which is the Greek word for salt, and then Cl for chlorine. Sodium, you can see, has 1 electron in its outer shell. So it is not stable. It really wants to just get rid of this 1 electron so that it has 8 electrons in the next shell. Okay, and then it's complete, and it's stable when it gives up that 1 electron. When it's got that 1 electron, it is very unstable because it will very readily bond with something else, give up this electron so that it has that stable shell. Chlorine is also unstable in its basic form because it's missing 1 electron. It has 7 electrons in its outer shell. Now, if you look at this and you think, oh my gosh, I'd totally ship sodium and chlorine together. They would make such a perfect pair. Totally true. So what happens when sodium and chlorine bind is that sodium gives its electron to chlorine. They both now have a non-normal number of electrons. And remember that electrons carry a negative charge. And so this is going to give the resulting atoms a charge of their own. So sodium is going to give up a negative, and it becomes a positive, and it becomes an ion. So you remember that this, the ionic bond, you're going to remember because the name's bond, ionic bond, taken, not shared. Got it? Okay. All right, so these are called an ionic bond because they make ions. Sodium gives up its outer electron. It becomes a positively charged ion, which we call a cation. Cation means positive charge. So it's given up a negative. When you subtract a negative number, you get a positive number. Chlorine has added a negative number, so it's going to become a negative ion. We actually change its name to chloride. Chloride is the ion, and it is an anion. An means negative or not. So the chlorine becomes chloride, which is an anion, right? So now we have formed an ionic bond between sodium and chloride. And now both of these atoms are very, very stable because their outer shells are complete. This sodium chloride is table salt. It's completely stable. Sodium, on the other hand, in its basic form, in its raw form, is a metal that is highly explosive. If you throw it in water, it explodes. It will catch fire and explode. Google sodium in water for some really great videos of explosions. Chlorine in its normal form is a poisonous gas because it binds to molecules, especially in your body. It binds to water to create chloride. So if you breathe chlorine gas, then it will bind to the water in your body and poison you. Now, for those of you who are thinking, but hang on, don't we put chlorine in water to sterilize the water? Yeah, we do. And the reason that it works is it binds with things in the water and kills off things like bacteria and fungus that might be harmful to you. But in low amounts, chlorine in water is perfectly safe to drink because it has become chloride. Cool, right? Chemistry is actually really cool. Okay, so that's an ionic bond because we gave ions. Each became an ion. So remember that an ion is negatively charged, anion is negatively charged, cation, positively charged. See, looks like it's okay. Okay. All right, now a chemical reaction, like I said, is just any rearrangement of chemical bonds, either making bonds or breaking bonds. So here's a chemical reaction where we take hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2. We have 2 molecules of hydrogen peroxide, which they didn't actually show here. And we can rearrange the bonds into 2 molecules of water and 1 molecule of oxygen gas, O2. And that's a chemical reaction. Here's another chemical reaction where we take sucrose, break the bond between these 2 sugars. Sucrose is table sugar, and it's made up of 2 simple sugars called glucose and fructose. And so by breaking this bond, we create a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. The groups of atoms involved in the chemical reaction are called functional groups. And on sugars, it's these OH groups, what we call a hydroxide. So you can see that here we have a bond to an O and then a bond. And then the corners here, all of these little corners, those are all carbons. When you write lots and lots of molecules that are very carbon heavy, you get really tired of drawing the letter C. So chemists just write them like this, and all of these corners are assumed to be carbon. So we have carbon bonded to oxygen, bonded to carbon. Okay? When we add water, we can then take the two hydrogens, break one of these bonds, put an OH on one of the carbons, and then put an H on the other oxygen. And now both of our sugars have an OH functional group. When we want to put those two back together, we can break this bond, take off the OH and an H, make a bond between this carbon and that oxygen, and we have an extra water. So we can reverse this chemical reaction. And a lot of chemical reactions are reversible, not all of them. Okay, now, creating chemical bonds requires the input of energy. So every time that we take these two molecules like this and put them together into a molecule like this, we have to use energy to make that bond. When we do that, we store energy in the bond. When we break that chemical bond, we release that energy. And that is why polymers are important in biology. Polymers are long strands of similar molecules. This polymer is starch, which is a super long strand of glucose monomers. Okay, poly means many, mono means one. So a polymer is many monomers. Monomers are the units. Think of monomers like Legos, and a polymer can be a big tower of Legos, okay? So in this case, these are all, say, red Legos, right? We could make a big tower out of different colors and shapes of Legos. And we'll talk about some polymers that are made with monomers that are not all exactly the same. We'll do that in another section. The cool thing about polymers is because there are all these chemical bonds within the polymer, they store a lot of energy, because remember, every chemical bond stores energy. The reason that evolution has shaped us to like foods that are high in starch is because starch has lots of readily available energy in these chemical bonds, and that our bodies directly use glucose to make energy in our cells. We'll come back to that as well. So starch is essentially just like really cheap energy for our bodies. So individuals who enjoyed eating starch tended to eat more starch, pass on the gene for enjoying starch, and were better able to absorb energy and have enough energy to survive and reproduce. And that is how evolution shaped us to really enjoy French fries. All right, so other molecules besides sugars that are polymers are proteins. Some carbohydrates are polymers, such as starch is a carbohydrate polymer. Also, nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, are also polymers. Okay, and we're going to learn more about those in the next chapter. Okay, so we've got two kinds of bonds that we've talked about so far. Covalent bonds, where we share electrons, which is what is happening here. Okay, these are all covalent bonds. Ionic bonds, where one atom gives up an electron and another atom takes the electron, creates an anion, which is negatively charged, and a cation, which is positively charged. And then when we make big, long molecules of the same kinds of molecules, we make a polymer. Okay, so that's it for that section. Stay tuned. We're going to learn more about chemistry.